Doesn't know me, my name is Jen Leone. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at HPD. And welcome to this presentation of Solar 101 and the HPD Solar Where Feasible mandate. With me are Noah Ginsberg and Annika Wister-Jones from nonprofit Solar One. Some of you may have already communicated with them through the solar feasibility analyses. But Noah's the director of Solar One's Here Comes Solar program, and Annika is the director of Affordable Solar. And just a little background, Solar One is a nonprofit organization with the twin goals of making solar energy accessible to everyone, but also to educate the greater New York community on solar energy and sustainability. And we've partnered with them. We, HPD, have partnered with Solar One to achieve both of those goals. Next slide. Today we're going to cover the following: an introduction to the Solar Where Feasible mandate and to Solar One in a little more depth. A little bit about the technology, solar economics. We'll walk through a few case studies, some tips for successful solar projects. And a note, we'll follow this with a Q&A, but if anybody has questions during the presentation, you can put them in the Q&A feature. And please do this instead of the chat. This way we can keep track of the questions and get them answered or saved till the end. And don't forget, next week will be a follow-up event where we'll talk more about the process of the HPD solar feasibility analysis. Next slide. So what are we doing here? I'm sure a lot of you know about this, but as part of the Climate Mobilization Act, local laws 92 and 94 require green roofs or solar on all new roofs. But until November 2024, most affordable housing can waive out for reasons of financial infeasibility and need only to comply with the laws to the extent determined by HPD. But we needed a way to figure out how to assess financial feasibility, but also to promote solar because we think it's a really good thing. And to address that, we created the Solar Where Feasible mandate. What is the mandate? It's a requirement that solar is installed where it is determined or deemed financially feasible by HPD. It's codified in enterprise green communities in the 2020 overlay for new construction and sub-rehabs, and also is required for projects going through LEED. And for preservation projects, it's embedded in the IPNA and the project scopes for those projects. And it states that projects must do a solar feasibility analysis and have a signed solar approval form for the enterprise green projects or to proceed with preservation finance for those. And waivers for projects that are subject to the DOB requirement are only available to projects that are deemed infeasible or are installing solar or cannot accommodate a solar system that is 4 kilowatts. Projects also, though, are encouraged to install solar even where they are not required to do so by HPD if they make sense economically or because they have other co-benefits. And with that, I will turn this over to Solar One. Thanks, guys.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jen. So just a quick introduction to Here Comes Solar and our project. Jen, as she said, we're a nonprofit in New York City. We do environmental education of all sorts. So we have a park on the East River. We do clean energy education in public schools. We have a workforce training program. But the Here Comes Solar project is specifically about technical assistance to make solar as easy in the city with multifamily buildings and affordable housing as it is for a single family home in the suburbs. So we do site assessments, we do workshops like this, we help with incentives and procurement of solar installers, and then we can do contract advocacy with the contractors for the installation process. And NYSERDA funded a 3-year partnership with HPD so that Solar One could make the Solar Where Feasible mandate something that involves as little extra effort for the teams as possible. So we can do all of the heavy lifting on information on solar. So I want to do a quick primer on how solar works and the basics of solar technology. And then we can get into a little bit more of the weeds on the economics and some more of the details on how to make solar a good project. But you probably know this already, but basically the way that solar works is energy comes in from the sun, is turned into electricity by solar panels, and then that electricity goes through wires to a box called an inverter, which converts the power from DC to AC. And then anything that isn't used immediately in the building by that account is sent out to the grid. And then you get a credit on your bill for that energy that you use that you can then use later. So if you generate a ton of energy during the day when all the lights are out, but the sun is shining, then you can use those credits that you've generated at night when the sun goes down, but you turn all the lights on and start using more energy for hallway lights and so forth. So over the course of the year, that actually, that kind of wave works out as well. So in the summer, we have a lot more hours of daylight, a lot more solar production. So you can rack up a bunch of credits and then use those in the wintertime when there's less sun. And then by the spring equinox, you're kind of back to zero and start the whole process again. Some basics on solar technology. It's incredibly low maintenance and long lasting. So solar panels have a 25-year operating life. They pretty much any reasonable solar panel has a warranty, a production warranty of 25 years. So that is great. It means that they'll last for a really long time and you can count on them. But it also means that they're really best on new roofs. Because if you think about it, if you need to replace your roof in 5 years or so, it's kind of a pain to have to take the solar panels off, replace the roof, put the solar panels back on. So that's one of the reasons why including solar as part of an HPD retrofit or new construction can be the best possible option. As I said, they're very low maintenance. There's no moving parts. The only electronic piece is that inverter, and they have very long and full coverage warranties and online monitoring, so you can check the production of the system without having to go up on the roof. You can just look at an app on your phone or on a website. They do require direct sunlight, so that means for us mostly that's just other buildings or maybe roof obstructions like chimneys or bulkheads. And they do have to be grid connected, which is great because it means that you can do that, get the credits for the energy that you produce, but it also means that solar will not provide backup power in a blackout unless you pair it with batteries. And a big asterisk on that, in New York City right now, it's, I would say, essentially impossible to do battery storage. There's some specific cases where it might be viable, but a rule of thumb is that it's not a good idea until the situation changes. So there's 3 major types of solar installations that are common on flat roofs like what we have in New York City. The first most common and cheapest is a ballasted array. So that's when the panels are laid out on racking and they're just weighed down with ballast. There's no roof penetration and it's a discrete system. It's great because it's low to the roof. It's very easy to install, and easy and cheap to install. The downside is that it takes a little bit more space. As you can see, you need space between the rows of panels so they don't shade each other. And you can only do it on low-rise buildings. DOB doesn't allow you to install a ballasted array above 100 feet because of wind load requirements. So the other option is a mechanically attached array or sometimes a planar array. This is mechanically integrated into the actual structure of the roof, so it's much more robust. It also, more robust, and it means that you can fit more panels in the same amount of space because you can fit them closer together. So on a small roof or a tall roof, this might be a better option. It's a little bit more expensive, but not by a ton. And then the last option is a type of mechanically attached array, but it's called a canopy or sometimes a pergola array. It means that the system is raised 9 feet in the air. And so that means anyone can walk underneath it. You can do roof work underneath it. You can have a garden or a roof deck underneath it. You can put HVAC equipment underneath it, whatever you want. It is the most expensive option, but it's also, there's a lot of opportunities for co-benefits. So there are definitely cases where even though it's more expensive, it can end up saving you more money in the long run and being a viable alternative. There's two main ways that you can use the solar energy credits that you get, and I think it's important to know this. One is using solar to offset the common area usage, the owner paid electrical costs. So that's hallway lights, laundry rooms, elevators, things like that. That's by far the most common way to use the energy. But another option that's sometimes really beneficial is when you take the same energy, but then split the credits up between the different residential electric bills using what's called community shared solar. And with community shared solar, it means you can reduce a little bit of each person's bill and provide direct savings to the residents. That only works in some cases if you have a roof that's big enough, if you have financing that allows for giving that benefit to the residents rather than taking it for the building itself. But it can be really beneficial in some cases. And also, as you're thinking about this, it's good to keep in mind that the owner paid electrical costs might change as you do retrofits or create a building. If you're doing lighting upgrades, then maybe the electrical usage will go down. Or if you're planning to include electrification measures, then the electrical needs for the owner paid costs might go up. So it's important to keep that in mind and design the solar to account for the projected electrical use. Any questions on these basics of solar panels and how solar works? It looks like we have a couple of things.
Yeah, Annika, so there are a couple of questions that came in through the chat about energy storage. Can you elaborate on why batteries are not commonly paired with solar in New York City?
Sure, yeah. The main issue, there's two main issues. One is true around the world, which is that batteries, and especially lithium ion batteries, are more costly than solar panels. That is changing by the day. It's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So we project that all batteries will become cost competitive very soon. The other issue specifically in New York City is that FDNY has very stringent guidelines, rules for where and how you can install a battery storage system. And it's not, at this point, because it's so new, it's not entirely clear how to thread the needle of getting through that process as well. So that adds another multiple layer of cost to any kind of battery system.
Great. And then another question that came in through the chat, is solar considered feasible if the minimum 4 kilowatts can only be achieved with a canopy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it depends on how financially feasible that canopy system is. So if the minimum 4 kilowatts can only be achieved by a more expensive system, but that system still pays for itself in less than 10 years, then it's still a financially beneficial system for the building, even if, you know, in a theoretical world, you could have gotten it cheaper if you didn't have, you know, a bulkhead or a taller neighbor or something. So it's really based on that, the financial benefit of the project for the building.
Great. Well, as folks have questions, please do feel free to enter them into the chat, into the Q&A feature. And we're going to keep moving into the next section of the presentation, which is all about solar economics. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, everyone talks about the ways that you can save money with solar, and you absolutely can. But the first thing is the upfront cost. Solar costs are typically presented in dollars per watt of capacity. And equipment costs have come down a lot over the last, they've been coming down for the last 40, 50 years, but really in the last decade is when we kind of cross a threshold where solar is cost effective for many, many, many applications in the New York region and all around the world. The equipment costs have come way down, driven by kind of ramping up global production and increased demand. But in New York City, we still do have some high soft costs associated with permitting and sort of fixed costs that you all are familiar with from your development projects. But some major cost drivers. So the price per watt will increase for a smaller system size because you're spreading out your fixed costs of engineering, permitting, mobilization, all of that over a smaller system size. Mechanically attached systems tend to be more expensive than ballasted systems. The ballasted installations have lower labor costs. Mechanically attached systems are a little bit more labor intensive to install. Taller buildings will tend to have more expensive solar installations. As the height of the building increases, the engineering requirements go up. That's one of the reasons that you can't do ballasted arrays on really high-rise buildings because of the wind loading requirements. There's also the long conduit run to bring your power you're generating on the roof down to the electric room that can add costs. Prevailing wage will increase the cost of an installation. And then creative system designs like elevated canopies or vertical wall integrated arrays, building integrated PV, that kind of stuff is also more expensive on a dollar per watt basis. Costs will come down with larger systems. So you do achieve economies of scale. Everything gets more efficient as the system size increases. Ballasted installations are cheaper, again, lower labor costs and quick to install. And then competitive procurement can also really drive down the cost of installation, particularly for development teams that are newer to solar. We strongly encourage competitive procurement, getting multiple bids and seeing where pricing is today, with it in mind that pricing has changed quite a bit over the last 4 or 5 years. The cost of solar has come down quite a bit in multifamily in New York City. And so certainly kind of keeping your finger on the pulse with what the going rates are for solar helps a lot. Next slide. So this is just a breakdown of average costs from the last couple of years, broken down by system size. So you can see small systems, less than 15 kilowatts. That would be the size of a system for, say, a 6-unit, 8-unit walk-up. It's really not that much bigger than a solar installation on a single-family home. Those are coming in at $4 to $5 per watt. And you can see the average price decreases as the size of the systems increase. A typical multifamily installation, we've got some examples down below. So for that 6 or 8 unit, 12 unit, maybe walk-up building, you can put an 8 kilowatt solar array on the roof, a mechanically attached system. That might be $5 per watt with a turnkey price of about $40,000. A larger system, a 30 kilowatt array, a ballasted system on, say, a 40 or 50 unit building, 6 stories, might come in at about $3.50 a watt, a little bit more than $100,000. Now on that same roof, you might be able to actually fit more solar if you installed an elevated solar canopy system. However, that is more expensive on a dollar per watt basis. So you could put a 40 kilowatt canopy on that roof for about $5 a watt, and you end up at about $200,000 turnkey. So these are just examples of pricing before any incentives are applied. We're going to get into incentives, and you'll see that those do defray a lot of the upfront cost. So now that we've talked about the cost of solar, we're going to talk about the ways that you save money with solar. And there are 2 major ways. The first is intuitive. You can reduce your utility bills with rooftop solar. Basically, all the energy that you're generating on your rooftop can be applied to your Con Ed electric bill or your PSE&G Long Island electric bill to offset your owner-paid electric costs. The savings will depend on a couple different factors. It's the output of the system, a high-performance system that's really, it's not shaded. It was well designed and well built. That's going to generate the most energy and deliver the most savings over time. Another factor is the utility rate that your building is on. And so if you're on the large commercial versus the small commercial or master metered residential rate, all of that will impact the amount of money that you save on your bill. Next slide. So the other way that you save money with solar is reducing your tax bills. So there are a couple of different, actually quite a few incentives for solar in New York City. There are both federal, state, and local incentives for solar in the city. And in New York, these incentives can offset more than half the cost of a system. So really generous incentives. And I'm going to go across the top of this chart from left to right. And so the first is an incentive that's available from NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, through their New York Sun program. So the New York Sun incentive is essentially a rebate that gets paid directly to the solar installer, and that reduces the upfront cost of a solar energy system to the building owner. The incentive for a typical multifamily building in New York City is currently 30 cents per watt, so maybe offsetting 10% of the cost of an installation. But for affordable housing, NYSERDA has an added incentive, and it's $1 per watt, which is a really generous incentive that can offset, between a quarter and a third of the total cost of an installation. And that is applicable to income restricted co-ops, for-profit rental and nonprofit rental properties, as long as they're affordable. There is a federal tax credit for solar. It's currently 26%, and Congress actually just extended that incentive for a few more years. You can see kind of below the chart how that incentive is scheduled to step down over time over the next 3-4 years. But that's an incentive that if the owner pays income taxes, then you can claim that incentive directly. If it's a low-income housing tax credit deal and you have a syndicator, your syndicator will likely pay for that tax credit. And if it's an owner-occupied property, so an income-restricted co-op or a home ownership program, then that federal tax credit can actually be passed through to the shareholders, and it gets passed through pro rata. And then whether or not an individual shareholder can take the incentive depends on their federal income taxes. If they pay income taxes, they can use that tax credit to defray what they owe. And then there's a state tax credit, which is really only applicable for owner-occupied properties, and then it's also passed through pro rata. And then accelerated depreciation. Solar is eligible for 100% year one bonus depreciation, which can be really valuable to a for-profit owner or a tax credit syndicator. And then last but not least, in New York City, we have a property tax abatement for solar. So it can't be combined with certain other tax incentives, but certainly worth checking to see if your building is eligible for the solar property tax abatement. Next slide. So when you combine all those incentives together, you can see that solar, the combination of those incentives and utility bill savings makes solar a really good investment for affordable housing in New York City. And even without tax incentives, solar can be a good investment. So these two example cumulative cash flows just show you, you could get a 5-year payback if you get those incentives. Even if you don't get any incentives, a typical payback period for solar in New York City is in kind of somewhere in that 10 to 15 year range. Solar plus low-income housing tax credits, a powerful combination. So if your building is being financed with low-income housing tax credits, solar can be included in the basis for low-income housing tax credits, as well as the solar investment tax credit. The combination of those two incentives on a solar project can yield really short payback periods. And basically the solar project can be fully paid for with incentives and just deliver savings. A sweet spot that we see with multifamily affordable housing is really those 4% low-income housing tax credit deals where the low-income housing tax credit allocation is uncapped. So you actually can include solar in your basis for both your LIHTC and your solar tax credit. And then this is just an example cash flow for a 4% low-income housing tax credit project that integrates solar. Next slide. Okay, so we've got two case studies. The first is Arthur Avenue Apartments. This is a project, a new construction project in the Bronx that was financed with 4% low-income housing tax credits. The developer was Foxy Management. The GC was Lend-Lease. The solar installer that they selected was Accord Power. It was a prevailing wage project, and they ended up installing about a 70 kilowatt canopy array. And the price of that system was a little bit more than $4 per watt. The payback period on that installation was 7 years, and it's projected after it pays for itself, is projected to deliver another $171,000 of utility bill savings to the owners. That project was completed last summer. Okay, and then this is another example. This is a preservation project in Brooklyn. This building owner, this is a privately owned property with an owner that just owns this one building, so not kind of a big real estate company. And he brought his building into HPD's Green Housing Preservation Program, selected solar energy systems to build out this solar project. It was a 35 kilowatt system, priced at $3.33 a watt. It also had a 7-year payback. This project was unique because not only did the system offset the owner paid electric expenses, they had enough roof area that they were able to fully offset the owner paid bill and to share some of the benefit directly with the low income residents in the property. So this project paid for itself based on the tax incentives and the owner paid electric bill offset in 7 years. But in addition to the economic benefits to the owner, it's also delivering almost $6,000 of annual bill savings to the residents under the roof. So a really, and one of the reasons that the owner agreed to do this, to oversize the solar array so that it would not only offset his bill, but also his tenants, was because he needed to achieve a certain energy reduction to access lower cost capital through the Green Housing Preservation Program. So this was a way to get him basically eligibility for the program, but also he was able to claim the tax incentives on the full cost of the installation. So it did provide him with incremental benefit, and it was doing the right thing for his tenants. This project was installed a little more than a year ago, and it's up and running. So with that, I think we're going to pause and open it up for some questions.
Great. No, I can ask you some questions. So we've got a couple lingering questions about solar technology and then some about economics as well. So how do roof cell towers impact the feasibility of solar panels?
That's a really important question. If you already have a cell tower lease, first you need to look at the lease and see what rights you've granted to that telecom company. They could have a lot of say over where you can put solar and where you can't. Generally speaking, you can put solar on a roof that also has a cell tower, no issue. It just does require a little bit of coordination to make sure that the two systems are not kind of getting in each other's way.
Yep. Why are ballasted systems not recommended for buildings over 100 feet?
It's a good question. So technically in New York City, you can install a ballasted array over 100 feet, but you cannot qualify for the solar property tax abatement if you have a ballasted system over 100 feet. So because, there's sort of an industry norm that for projects over 100 feet, you don't do ballasted. The real issue, just from a kind of a technical perspective, is that as you go up, the wind gets stronger. And so you need to put more and more ballast, more and more weight on that system in order to comply with the wind requirements. So mechanical attachments as you go up in height become, more and more necessary. And also, there are limits to how much weight you can put on a structure. So, typically we see a lot of ballasted installations on roofs that are 7 stories and under, and then as buildings get taller, it becomes less feasible.
Great. This one is very fun. For small multifamily buildings with existing flat roofs, might we consider creating a lightweight framing for a sloped roof directed to exposure to add more PV panels, something like a hybrid to the pergola situation?
So this question came from Sarah. Sarah, that's a really interesting question, and I'd love to talk more about it. There are mechanically attached solutions that are quite common for small multifamily rooftops, but there's definitely a need for innovation in this space. There are a couple of local companies that have developed solutions for small flat roof properties, including Brooklyn Solar Works and Urban Energy, to name a few. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a need for more innovation in the space and more creative solutions to get solar on the small buildings.
And Sarah, I'm not sure what type of properties you work with, but that's exactly the kind of thing that's worth thinking about at the planning stages of a new construction project. And we'll talk about that next. So I applaud your creativity, and we should definitely be thinking about more things like that. The next question is, what's the amount of the federal tax credit? Is it the entire cost of the solar or less the incentive?
That's a really good question, and we're going to get into that in sort of the tips and considerations section of the presentation. But the short answer is it depends. You can treat it for a rental property. You can treat it either way, but it has implications for whether you need to kind of pay taxes on the other incentives.
And Sarah had another question about if there's any work to try to make solar usable while the grid is down. Yeah.
That's a great question. So first, we're optimistic that the fire department challenges and the permitting challenges to batteries in New York City are going to get cleared up in the next few years. Frankly, I think that they need to. But until that happens, storage is challenging, and that's the most straightforward way that you can make your solar energy system useful when the grid goes down in those rare instances. But there are other options. We've worked on solar projects that include essentially just like a dedicated outlet that can be charged directly from the solar panels. So these kinds of dedicated plugs can provide charging for devices, cell phone charging, laptop charging, that kind of thing when the sun is shining, and they're not too expensive. So we've worked on a handful of projects that included that. They initially wanted storage, and when they kind of looked into it and realized it was not feasible for them to include storage, then these kind of auxiliary plugs were a good kind of plan B.
Yeah. And it looks like we've got a ton of questions left, which is fantastic. I'm so excited how much response we're getting. So I'm going to save some of them for the next section so we can just keep going with tips. And then we'll answer all of these. There were a couple that are very specific to 15 Stratford. So I'm just going to go back quickly and answer these. One question was whether the units at Stratford Avenue were individually metered. Yes, for this project, they are individually metered. And so you're able to benefit the tenants by using community shared solar. If you have a master metered building, it's actually much simpler because the solar is just associated with that master meter and it reduces the whole building's usage and bills. And so it benefits everyone equally without having to put any extra effort in with community solar. And then the other question was about a dual tilt solar system. Noah and I were actually taking bets on whether anyone would notice that. Dual tilt means that you have solar panels facing 2 different directions. So I actually took this picture while the system was in progress. So they had installed half of the panels, but not the other half. So you can see there's a space in between here. And that's where the next half of solar panels are going to go. And so they kind of look like that. So congratulations on noticing that. Let's keep going. So the next section is about tips for successful solar projects and things to keep in mind. So starting off with things to know about what makes a building a good candidate for solar. So this is useful if you're working with an existing building to just have a sense of whether your building is probably good for solar or not. It's also good for new construction because then you can think about how to design a building to be as favorable as possible for solar if you'd like. So things that we look for are things like a large available roof area, a building that's solar ready. We'll talk about that in a second. If it's eligible for tax credits, obviously, if you can get free money, you should take it. Low-rise buildings are usually helpful, like what Noah was talking about with the wind load and the conduit. And a ballasted design tends to help. So then, Noah, do you want to talk through unfavorable factors?
Sure, yeah. So you're going to have a tough time putting solar on a roof if it's small and full of mechanicals and shaded. If it's a high-rise building, that's going to contribute to high costs. If your project's not eligible for any of the solar tax incentives, those are all things that are going to make your project less economically feasible. You could probably still do a project. It might still be cost effective if it has kind of 1 or maybe 2 of these issues. But, as you have kind of more and more of those challenges, that's going to draw your payback period out beyond 10 years, or you might just not have the physical space available for a solar project.
So then as I was saying before, you can help your building become more solar favorable with a couple solar ready tips. So there's some things that you can do that are fairly simple. Like if you're already doing electrical work in a building, then you can run conduit to the roof. That's often one of the more expensive elements of the solar design. And so if it's already being done as part of the roof work then, or the building work, then it can be cheaper that way. Making sure that the common area electrical service panel is big enough to accommodate the solar. It would be a shame if you put in a new service panel and then discover, a couple weeks or months later when the solar is installed that it's not big enough for the solar. So making sure to accommodate that. And then also, and this I think is useful to look at this picture here, if there is mechanical equipment on the roof, to try to consolidate it all in basically the same place. And if possible, just to the north of any bulkhead or shade elements of the roof. The sun is more often than not in the southern part of the sky for solar panels. And so if there is shade from the south of the solar panels, they probably won't produce much. So on this building, we would only want to put solar panels here anyway. So the fact that they put the mechanical equipment there makes it very convenient. If you want to do more deep solar readiness, like from the ground up, concentrating bulkheads on the northern side of the building, like I said, to minimize shading, keeping wide open spaces to be able to do large uninterrupted solar arrays, and all of the simple elements as well. As you may notice, many buildings that exist in New York City are already deeply solar ready. So that's very convenient.
All right, thanks, Annika. Next tip here is whenever possible, use bulk procurement for your solar project. So particularly for small projects, for these kind of low-rise, mid-rise buildings that you can't put a huge amount of solar on that one rooftop. If you can increase the size of your project or work in collaboration with others to participate in a bulk RFP, you're going to get better pricing for solar design and construction services. So if you are an owner with a portfolio of properties and you're thinking about putting solar on some of your properties, a recommendation would be look at them, you don't have to go crazy, but if you look at them all and you figure out that you have multiple buildings that are good for solar, you can bid them out together and get better pricing. Another option would be participating in some of the bulk RFPs that Solar One and HPD run. We do on a quarterly basis. We run an RFP for mostly for HPD preservation projects, but it's really for any HPD building that's integrating solar. And participating in one of those, you benefit from the economies of scale that you get by pooling your purchasing power with other affordable housing providers that are also looking to do solar.
Okay, so the next step after procuring a solar installer is thinking about how to choose a contractor. After you've released the RFP, thinking about how to select the installer. And so Solar One can help with procurement and bid comparison, regardless of whether you're doing it through the bundled RFPs that we do or on your own. But things to look for are things like qualifications. So making sure that they have good insurance, they have all the correct licenses, and they're approved by NYSERDA. Their corporate track record, their projects specifically in New York City. As I'm sure you know, the landscape in New York is very different from anywhere else in the state. So if there's a installer that has a lot of experience, but it's all in like the Albany area, that might not translate as well to New York. And specifically multifamily affordable housing experience is another thing that's kind of unique. So keeping an eye out for that. You also want to look at the proposal quality. So what the solar design is, whether it's appropriate for the roof, what the equipment is that they're using and what their warranties are, and their implementation plan, how detailed it is, how much it matches with the other work that you're going to need to do. And then, obviously, people think about pricing. That's often the first thing that you think about, but we encourage you to think of pricing as just one element in a full review. So pricing definitely should be part of the picture, but so should your interview with the installer, if you can have that, making sure that they have good communication, making sure to check their references. I'm sure everyone on this call has an example that can come to mind of choosing something based solely on pricing and then realizing that they're missing some other key element. So we always recommend that you secure multiple bids to make sure that the proposal you're getting is high quality and competitively priced. And we also recommend that you interview the solar contractors before selection if you can. Personalities are definitely a factor in any kind of work that you do. And so making sure that everyone has a good rapport is always important. And as I said before, don't let price be the only factor in making this decision.
Great. So this next one is just thinking about the structure of your contract. And so this is in the context of a development project. This slide makes more sense. So if you're doing other work at the site and you have a general contractor, then one model that you could implement, the single prime model as we're calling it, is just to have your solar contractor fold in under your GC, just like all the other trades. And then work with your development team on contracting, execution, coordination, and everything like that. The other option would be to enter into a separate prime contract with your solar installer. Now that might sound kind of strange, if you're used to working with the GC and having all the trades folded under them. But just for context, in the solar industry, solar companies, generally speaking, are design build firms. So they kind of do everything turnkey for most of their clients. And so they're used to working directly with owners on their projects. Ultimately, we generally do recommend the single prime model for complicated projects where you're doing a lot of other work and roof replacement and everything else. For probably the single biggest reason is just to simplify the contracting process, but also to simplify the coordination on the installation. So we've done it both ways. HPD has done it both ways, and I don't think that there's a hard, fast rule that it needs to be one way or the other. But the only drawback that we can think of, really, with having the solar company be a sub to the GC is that the GC is going to charge a markup for their role, kind of supervising and coordinating. But based on our experience working on projects both ways, there's something of a consensus that those are dollars well spent.
Yeah, the fewer people who have to go through HPD's requisition process, the better from everyone's perspective, including HPD. Okay, so we alluded to this earlier, but the question about how to take the federal tax credit was a very good one, because there are different ways that you can maximize tax incentives if you have a tax basis. So if you're a nonprofit, then this is probably less relevant. But if there's tax basis to work with, then there's a couple of things you can do. So one is using the NYSERDA incentive to increase the total cost and then be able to take the federal tax credit on that total cost. So there's two ways that you can do it. You can either have the NYSERDA rebate paid directly to the installer, which will automatically reduce the cost by that amount, or you can have NYSERDA pay that incentive directly to the owner, in which case the total paid cost is higher, and then the federal tax credit is on that higher amount. So that's something that we can work with you and determine, what's the best situation. Sorry, what's the best solution for your situation? But it's good to know that it's an option in the cases where it's relevant. And then the other thing is what's called safe harboring, which is just specifically about the fact that the federal tax credit is scheduled to step down year over year. So if the tax credit is going to be going away, or reducing or going away before you believe your system will be complete, then you can safe harbor the tax credit by purchasing some portion of the equipment before the deadline, even if the installation happens later. So we can help you with that as well.
Great. And so then the last piece here is just a quick overview of solar operations and maintenance. So fortunately, there's not a lot of maintenance required for solar PV. It's really reliable technology. Manufacturer warranties are typically 25 years for solar panels and 10 to 12 years on the inverters. You can get extended warranties on the inverters that go out 20 years. And then solar companies are offering typically 5 to 10 years workmanship warranties. So the combination of those things give you a lot of coverage. And then every PV system that's been installed in the last 5-10 years is equipped with a solar monitoring system where you can log into a website and see your solar production and set it up so that it sends alerts to your solar company and to your staff if there's an issue. So, with that, it's really, I don't want to say set it and forget it, but it's close to that. Something else that you can do, just a best practice, is that when you're completing your solar project, just as kind of like a last, a last walkthrough with the solar installer, they can do a walkthrough with the building staff, your super, and just explain kind of how everything works, where the disconnect switches are, so that the building staff are familiar with the system. And you could have your building staff just go and take a look at the array, once every month or two, just to visually inspect it and see that there aren't any kind of anything going on. And if you do notice something that seems wrong with the solar installation, the first thing to do is to call your solar company. They'll potentially be able to remotely diagnose any issues using online monitoring, or they'll schedule a service visit to come out. And With that, we're wrapping up, and we'll have 5 minutes for questions. And so in conclusion, HPD Solar Where Feasible is a win-win policy. HPD is only requiring solar when it's beneficial to the building. The early bird catches the worm. So the earlier that you incorporate solar into your project, the better your solar design is going to be. Solar ready designs are going to have a lower cost. They're going to be more cost effective. Another takeaway is that solar can be optimized. You can really maximize your return on investment by optimizing your solar design, and also looking at ways that you can maximize your incentives. Developers are encouraged to find co-benefits. So when you put solar on a building, there are other, it interacts with other parts of your building. So you could do an elevated solar canopy that could provide a shade structure for residents, or to the extent that you have a tenant accessible rooftop space. You can also maximize solar production, which will defray the cost of electrification in the future. If we're moving towards no fossil fuel combustion in buildings, that means higher electric bills, right? So generating as much solar as you can on site is really beneficial. And then last but not least, solar technical assistance and tools are available. So Annika and I and our team at Solar One were available to provide free consultation and procurement assistance for solar on any affordable housing projects that are coming into HPD. HPD's solar screening tool is simple, and it's designed for non-solar professionals. We're going to be doing a whole training that gets into the solar screening tool next week, which we encourage you to come out to. And with that, I think we're wrapping up. I want to thank everyone for your attendance and participation, and we're going to answer additional questions that are coming in through Q&A, and we will be sending around a link to the recording as well as the slides to everyone who registered for the webinar. So thanks again, and let's dive into the questions.
Yeah. So one of the questions that was asked earlier was whether avian prevention measures are necessary for solar installations. Not for most solar installations. There are some specific situations where you're in, I've seen for like carports or like freestanding structures, very large structures, or structures that are like in very high traffic bird areas. Sometimes they can be nice to have, but they're definitely not necessary. Noah, could you answer, does the conflict of an existing cell tower lease qualify the project as not feasible?
That's a good question. I think that the short answer is yes, it could. Again, having a cell tower on a building does not mean it can't have solar. It just means that the cell tower needs to be considered when you pursue solar. So I can't speak for HPD. I don't think that they would grant a blanket waiver for a building just because it has a cell tower. But if you thoroughly explored it and your telecom company pointed to a provision in your lease which said, you could not use this space and that space, and therefore there wasn't enough roof area available, then yeah, I think HPD would grant a waiver.
Right. The next question I want to answer is whether canopies or mechanical attachments can be done in historic districts, and will landmarks allow them to be seen from the street? I think that there's two answers to that. Landmarks will not allow them to be seen from the street. So you're correct that that is a hard no. But there are many situations where you can install solar without it being seen from the street. This is not a landmark building, but you can imagine these panels are so low below the bulkhead that you couldn't possibly see them from the street. So that would be totally fine. You just have to do a line of sight test to determine that.
Right, and then there's a little bit of wiggle room in kind of seen from the street. The rule is that the system needs to be minimally visible. So you could if you can see it, but it's not obtrusive, then you can make a case to the Landmark Preservation Commission. Another question that came in is, how do we get the HPD NYSERDA adder? So this is a great question. There's a list that NYSERDA has of documents that you can provide as evidence that it's income restricted affordable housing. And really your solar installation company is going to be responsible for applying for the NYSERDA incentive on your behalf. So the most important thing is making sure that your solar contractor knows that it is income restricted affordable housing, and then providing them with the documentation that they request.
Let's see, there's one question about the startup or out-of-pocket cost for a 3-family angled roof. That's a really hard question to answer without knowing more of the details of the building, but I can say that often pitched or angled roofs can have slightly lower costs than flat roofs in some situations. But then because they tend to be smaller, they might not get the economies of scale. So I would assume it's a small system, and so, you know, relatively small cost, but that's definitely something that we can look at very clearly, or you could put it into the solar screening tool and kind of estimate it yourself.
Great. A couple more technical questions here. Is the kilowatt hour usage to size a system evaluated based on a full year? Yes, we ask for 12 months of electric bills when we size a solar energy system. And then another is, what is the area that's required for a solar project, and how many watts can fit in a square foot? So we typically use, just as a rule of thumb, 12, maybe 14 watts per square foot. It does depend on the mounting method, but that's a good rule of thumb. And I believe that we've answered all of the questions that came in through the Q&A, and it is exactly 2:30. So we're gonna stop the recording and thank everyone again for coming. We're happy to stick around for a few more minutes if any of you do have questions. Please do reach out to us, affordable@solarone.org. If you would like a free consultation for solar on your multifamily affordable housing property. We're looking forward to seeing many of you next week on Tuesday, April 20th at 1:30 for our workshop that's going to be all about HPD's solar feasibility analysis and the screening tool.
I do want to say for that next workshop, if you joined us in January for our last round of workshops, we've made a fair number of updates to the screening tool and the process of the feasibility analysis. So it would probably be good to join that one as well, just to see what the updates are.